Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. Have you ever seen a mythological spirit or ghost animal, or a nature spirit or entity, or other spooky occurrences with animals? What's your experience? Story 1. The haunted cat that followed us everywhere.
When I was in college, my roommate and I were walking around town at around 2 a.m. As we walked, we passed a dead cat in the gutter. It was a calico cat with a big brown spot on one side and an orange one on its face. The cat had clearly been dead for a while, and rigor mortis had already set in. There was a greasy smear under its head, and we assumed it had been run over by a car. We walked down to a park, wandered around for a while, and then came back the same way. A car passed us, and in its headlights we saw a calico cat crossing the road away from us. We got back to the spot where the dead cat had been, and it was gone. Same storefront, same streetlight, same greasy smear in the gutter, but no cat. Over the rest of the semester, that cat kept showing up in the strangest places. One night, it even chased my roommate and his friend down the street, on the far side of town from where we first saw it. There was also a time when we got a note from our resident advisor saying she wanted to see us. We knocked on her door, and without a word she walked us to our room, opened the door, took one look at the mess and said, "Oh wow, there's no way you're keeping a cat in here. Sorry." Rumi and I looked at each other in confusion. The resident advisor then said, "One of the groundskeepers said they saw a cat in your window." We asked her what it looked like. It was white, with brown and orange spots. The second incident happened in a different town, walking around a neighborhood at some odd hour with a different friend. Down a side street, 3 dogs approached us, wagging their tails. One was white, one was black, and the other was a greyish color, like a husky. They were all unusually tall, standing more than 3 feet high, with long, low tails that only slightly curved. And they were very lanky, not like underfed dogs, but more like something not quite domestic. It's really hard to describe why they were so strange, but they followed us for about a mile. Eventually they sniffed a small hedge, which was dark but completely visible on all sides. After sniffing, they found a gap in the hedge and disappeared through it. I can accept that the dogs were just strange and not necessarily paranormal, though they acted really oddly, and I can't explain it. But that cat was different. It was actively hostile and appeared in my room when I was in class, after it was dead.
Story 2. Strange creature in Ohio.
I'm from southeastern Ohio originally, one of the tiny towns buried halfway in the woods and partway on the river. And I've actually seen the thing you're talking about, or maybe a cousin, since I live nowhere near there anymore. It's not really giving out personal information, and the town I won't name is all on drugs now anyway. So it's not really a vacation destination for anyone, sadly. Somewhere just down the road from Marietta, there's a high school on the river. You'd know the one if you'd been there. It's blue and gold and the worst school I've ever experienced. Near that school is a little dirt road I always thought of as an arrow extending from the main road, because the main road is curved like a bow, but this road goes up a hollow before doing what Ohio back roads always do. I don't remember why we were out there, or why we took that way. Great-grandpa lived out that way before he died, but there was an easier path to the farm from in town. not 30 minutes out of the way like this was. The light in the valley was blue, but in the hollows, full dark is different, colder and stranger. We hit a semi-rare paved section, rarer in those days for sure, and picked up speed only to come around a corner and have deer explode off the hillside in front of us like it was fired from a cannon. It was booking it to get away from something. And, as I looked, expecting to see a bear, it slinks off the hillside just past our headlights. I will testify to this day it was a cat, and huge. I've seen jaguars in documentaries, but those things were Peter Parker compared to this enormous creature. It had a head like a shovel, and had to be longer from nose to tail tip than my dad was tall. The thing ate its Wheaties for sure. It stopped for a second in the road, looked at us for another long second like it was thinking, and then walked to the edge of the road where there was a steep drop-off. Easily 80 degrees and just poof, gone. We turned off the truck to try and hear any rocks falling, but there was nothing. And neither of us were down to face something that size by getting out of the truck. But I swear to God and Satan that thing wasn't a normal cat. 1, no normal cat eye flash even in the high beams. 2, I swear it felt like the thing was contemplating getting rid of witnesses full-on mob style. Many times I have felt I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to for one reason or another. That was one of the worst instances of that feeling. I asked one of my old teachers about it a few days later, and she said she'd seen it too, only across the river on the outskirts of Belpre. Someone else said he'd heard a drug dealer from Akron or somewhere released his cat in Wayne National Forest when it got too big. I just think the woods are too thick for us to really know what's in them. When you grow up near and in Appalachia, weird things just become Tuesday. Anyone can attest that the hills around that area do some weird things. I've seen lights I can't explain over distant rises, and once watched from my grandmother's front step with other people as across the river on top of, or maybe behind a hill, it looked like something was burning, and something huge. Like a steel plant caught fire, orange light in the sky for quite a ways, dancing and flickering. My uncle has been in the local volunteer fire department for years and called the station, asking if they'd heard anything from that way, and they said the radio was pretty much silent all night. We never found out what it was. I have so many stories from living throughout Ohio, West Virginia, and down into North Carolina.
Story 3. The mysterious footprints in the snow.
One cold morning, my girlfriend and I were laying in her bed, enjoying the rare day off. The snow had fallen heavily, and we didn't have work or school that day. Her house was way out in the middle of nowhere, with no neighbors for miles around, just endless woods and a winding road. It was peaceful, quiet, and serene. But then, something broke the silence. I heard a voice, clear as day, right outside the window. It whispered, "Get down, they're going to be able to see you if you don't get down." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My immediate thought was that it was some kind of prank or a misunderstanding. But when I turned to look, what I saw stopped me cold. A man, accompanied by 3 dogs, was walking toward the garage door, their footprints crunching in the fresh snow. The man appeared normal, but the dogs, there was something unsettling about them. I didn't know why, but I suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of danger. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my handgun, determined to confront them and figure out what they were doing on our property. I rushed to the door, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and flung it open. But when I stepped outside, nothing. The yard was empty. No man, no dogs, just the cold, still air. I looked down at the snow, and my breath caught in my throat. There, right outside our window, were fresh shoe prints and paw prints, both leading toward the garage. My pulse quickened as I followed the trail. I moved cautiously down the back of the property, tracking the prints for what felt like an eternity. The prints continued for about 100 yards, but then they stopped. The only tracks left were the paw prints, growing fainter with each step. Then I noticed something even stranger. To my left, about 10 to 15 yards away, there were similar paw prints, but these looked like they had come from the forest and were heading straight toward the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I continued following the trail, but as I got closer to the house, I saw something I didn't expect. Shoe prints had appeared again. Right there, about 25 yards from the house. I followed them further, thinking maybe they'd lead out the front of the property. But there was nothing. No more prints, no sign of anyone, no explanation. To this day, I don't know what happened that morning or what was outside our window. I still can't shake the eerie feeling that something was watching us, waiting for us to notice it. I can't explain the tracks or the voice. I just know one thing: it wasn't human.
Story 4. The Black Cat.
One summer night, over a decade ago, I stayed with my girlfriend at her house. I was sleeping on a pull-out bed in the living room. Due to my hay fever, I was in and out of sleep, constantly using my inhaler to ease the tightness in my chest. The window was open, letting in the night air as the heat of summer lingered. As I lay there half asleep, I felt something cold and soft suddenly land on my chest. I woke up with a start to find a pure black cat sitting there staring at me. My heart raced, but I stroked it gently and it purred in return. The cat then hopped off and padded over to a nearby armchair, curling up to sleep. I was confused but chalked it up to my half-drowsy state. Earlier, my girlfriend had mentioned having 2 cats. I had already met one, a white and ginger mix, but this one was completely black. The second cat usually hid from strangers, so I thought it was a compliment that it had come to me. The next day, I asked her about the black cat, but she seemed surprised. She explained that she had only one living cat now, and it was the white and ginger one I had met earlier. Her other cat, the black one, had passed away years ago. I didn't know what to make of it. Was it just a vivid dream, a strange trick of my mind from being in and out of sleep, or was there something more to it? Later, I found out that this wasn't the first time someone had mentioned a visit from the old black cat. Her friends had experienced it too. A lingering presence, perhaps, or something more sinister. I don't know, but every time I think of that night, a chill runs down my spine.
Story 5. The Phantom Dog.
When I was very young, my parents and grandparents lived in the same town. If they decided to go out for a night by themselves, they would drop us off at my grandma and grandpa's house. We would typically be treated to a large Midwestern meal of steak, baked potatoes, and chopped lettuce with ranch dressing, way too much of it. by the end of the night, there were always leftovers which my grandparents' dog Max loved. Max was a big grey dog that resembled a German shepherd. Like most farm dogs, he didn't have a breed you could identify specifically, but he had pointy ears, a long snout, and a deep bark. Every night, whenever my sister, cousins, or I stayed over at my grandparents' house, it was almost a ritual to take the leftovers out to Max. I should mention at this point that my cousins and I were all within a 4-year age gap, except for my youngest cousins who were twins, 12 years younger than I was, and 8 years younger than their older sister. I was the oldest among us by 2 years. My grandparents kept Max tied up next to a shed on their property. Max was notorious for being a snitch. If any of us were doing something we weren't supposed to, like on the swing set or the tire swing, he would bark and howl, alerting my grandma to come outside and shout at us. We had an unspoken rule to avoid anything inappropriate while Max was around. We loved Max and played with him often. He was an old dog, but he was still spry and loved the attention we gave him. Max was a big dog who loved being scratched around his collar, and we enjoyed playing with him, despite him being a big snit. I believe I was around 12 the last time I saw him. I remember noticing lumps forming around his neck. I didn't hear about his passing, but by the time we moved to a house about an hour and a half out of town, I noticed that during the rare trips back to my grandparents' house, Max was gone. A few years later, my family had a dog that had to be put down due to a soil-borne worm infection common in states bordering the Mississippi River. It was a painful death for a good dog, and I was really upset. I asked my dad what had happened to Max, hoping it was something cleaner. He looked at me, confused, and asked how I knew who Max was. We stared at each other for a moment, and I explained that my sister and I used to play with him all the time. We were definitely old enough to remember him. At that point in my life, I thought my dad must have thought I was too young to remember details correctly, so I shrugged it off. He told me that he had only 2 dogs growing up. One was Boots, a dog my grandparents got while he was in college. But when he was a little kid, his parents adopted a farm mutt named Max. As far as he knew, they never had any other dogs. My first reaction was disbelief. I was about 16 at the time, and I was sure I knew the dog. I described him, unprompted, and my dad confirmed that Max was a big, grey, German shepherd-looking mutt. I went on to describe the lumps around his neck, and my dad said Max had to be put down due to cancer around the time he was in high school. The next time I saw my grandfather, I asked him about Max, and he confirmed that Max had been put down in 1973. I was born in 1987, which didn't make sense. They figured I must have seen a picture of him with my dad and mixed up the memory. I brought it up to my cousins during a family gathering. We all remembered Max, but the timeline was off. It seemed like we all remembered him when we were around 6 years old, and then we stopped seeing him once we became teenagers. My younger cousin even asked, did something happen to Max, when we talked about it. My sister, however, stopped seeing him when I did, well before her teenage years. And I should mention that my sister and I are the only siblings in the family that are close in age. I continued to assume that my grandparents and father were wrong, that they had confused the dates or were just getting old and forgetting things. At 16, I was convinced I knew everything, but then the next year we tore down the shed in their yard. Underneath it was a huge concrete slab where Max had been tied up. While we were ripping down the shed, I found a very small child's handprint. Above it was the name Dale, which is my father's name. Next to it was a large paw print, and above it was written Max. At that moment, I began to accept that maybe I had seen a picture of him, mixed up some memories, and spread that false memory to my cousins and sister. But to this day, I can't recall seeing any picture of Max. My cousins agreed, and it became a running joke that I had convinced them that there was a dog at my grandparents' house. It wasn't until years later when my youngest cousins, the ones who were 12 years younger than me, began to mention that they also had to be sneaky on the swing set, because if they went down it backwards, Max would start barking.
Story 6. Padfoot's Midnight Visit.
I've had a few strange animal-related experiences in my life, but one stands out among them all. A chilling encounter I had while staying at a quaint inn. The innkeeper made no mention of any pets during my check-in, which was odd because usually innkeepers will inform you if any animals roam freely through the rooms. But that night I was completely unaware of anything out of the ordinary. In the dead of night, I woke up suddenly, feeling the sensation of something licking my hand. My hand was hanging over the side of the bed, and the gentle licks seemed familiar, as if it were a dog. I opened my eyes to find a long-haired black dog standing right beside me. At first, I thought it was a delightful surprise, a little guest making its presence known in the most unexpected way. I reached my hand out to pet it, but as I touched its face, my hand passed straight through it, as if the dog were nothing more than mist or an illusion. The figure quickly faded, vanishing from sight entirely. And in that instant, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I sprang out of bed, confused and disoriented, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. Had I been dreaming? Was it a hallucination caused by a restless sleep? I couldn't explain it. I walked around the room, trying to ground myself in reality, but the air felt heavy, as if something unseen lingered. I chalked it up to a hypnopompic hallucination, one of those strange, in-between dream states where reality and sleep blur together. The next morning during breakfast, I mentioned the odd encounter to the innkeeper. To my surprise, they weren't shocked. They casually explained that many guests had reported similar experiences with a long-haired black dog at night. So frequent were these sightings that the dog had earned a name, Padfoot. The innkeeper even pointed to the guest book I'd signed the night before. Scanning through the pages, I found numerous references to Padfoot from past visitors. What sent a chill through me was the revelation that the owners had never owned a black dog. No one knew where Padfoot came from, or why he continued to appear in the middle of the night. I left that inn with a lingering unease, unsure whether I had witnessed a ghost or if something far darker was at play. Either way, I would never forget the eerie feeling of that dog's presence in the dead of night.
Story 7. Encounter with a Skinless Cryptid.
One night, my buddy and I were driving home around 9 p.m. in South Carolina. The sky was clear, with nothing to obscure our view. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something large on all fours, skinless, almost Canaan-like. In a flash, it pounced on a neighborhood cat. And before I could even process what I had just seen, the creature disappeared into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't say anything at first, unsure if what I saw was real. I just kept driving, but the image haunted me. After a few minutes of silence, my friend suddenly spoke. "Did you see that?" he asked. I froze for a moment, then nodded. We both knew something was wrong, but we didn't have the words for it. This experience stuck with us, and we've talked about it often since then. There's been talk in the southeastern United States of a skinless predator that lurks in the night. Some people call it a cryptid, though there's little consensus on its true nature. I've heard rumors of similar sightings in the area, but we're both certain it wasn't a coyote or any other animal we've encountered before. For one, there are no wolves or coyotes in our neck of the woods, especially not in the neighborhoods we were driving through that night. I've spent a lot of time camping in the area, and while I've seen coyotes on the outskirts of Charleston, this wasn't the same. The creature didn't move like a coyote at all. It was something entirely different, something wrong. I've also come to learn that the area is home to other mysterious figures, like the infamous lizard man of Scape Ore Swamp. But what we saw that night still lingers in my mind. A creature with no skin, preying on whatever it can in the dead of night. I don't know what it was, but I know I never want to see it again.
Story 8. Black-eyed creature.
When I was a kid, I would often experience sleep paralysis. And during those terrifying moments, I almost always saw the same thing. It wasn't just a random hallucination. It was a creature. Something I can only describe as resembling Gollum from Lord of the Rings, but it was different. This creature had solid black eyes, and its body was more muscular than anything from my nightmares. I would wake up, unable to move, trapped in my own body. Every time it would be sitting beside my bed, right next to my head, just staring at me with those dark, lifeless eyes. The creature's presence was suffocating, like the air itself was being drained out of the room. It made the most horrifying sounds too, its teeth clicking together, sharp and grating, like Hannibal Lecter savoring his next victim. The sound would send a chill down my spine, each click feeling like it pierced deeper into my mind. The thing would sometimes shake with what I can only describe as excitement, its body trembling with a strange, unsettling energy. Other times it would sit there, eerily still, crying in a low, guttural sob that echoed through the silence of the room. As a child, I thought maybe it was just my imagination, that my mind was playing tricks on me during those sleepless nights. But then, something strange happened. One day my mom, without any prompting from me, told me about a creature she had seen. The description she gave was nearly identical to the one I had been seeing during my sleep paralysis episodes. I remember the cold rush of realization that followed. This wasn't just some random nightmare I had made up. My mom had seen it too. Over time, I began to wonder, was this thing real? Was it a ghost, a demon, or something else entirely? To this day, I still can't shake the feeling that whatever it was something more than just a figment of my imagination. It's as though the creature was connected to my fear, feeding off it in ways I can't explain.
Story 9. The invisible house guest.
When I was a teenager, I had something strange happen to me. It started when a friend was looking at me strangely and suddenly blurted out that there was a woman following me. I looked all around and he said, "No, she's here, but she's not here." I asked him to explain, but then he started laughing it off, saying he must just be crazy. Soon after, strange things started happening in my room. The little metal ornamental pieces on my day bed would randomly launch into the air, and scrunchies would be thrown at my head. Nothing ever hurt. It was just annoying. It happened so often that I would get frustrated and yell at it when it was messing with me. It also did this to two of my friends. One of my friends, however, didn't like it as much. She was more of a friend or enemy, but I'll get to that in a minute. One night, I was in bed with the lights off, ready to sleep. My bedroom door was closed, and I could hear the TV that my aunt was watching in the living room. I felt someone sit down on the end of my bed and heard a woman's voice say my name. I sat up, all happy, thinking that my mom had gotten off early from work and snuck into my room to say goodnight. But it wasn't my mom. I remember being terrified, but I don't remember anything else. My next memory is waking up the next morning. A few days later, one of my good friends and my other friend were at my house after school. We were watching television in the living room, then decided to go to my room to hang out. My friend said she was thirsty and went to the kitchen to get some juice, while my other friend and I went to my room. A minute later, we heard my friend scream from the kitchen. We ran in there to find her cowering on the floor, crying, with 3 scratch marks on her cheek. One of the scratches even broke the skin, and there was a tiny bit of blood. My other friend was asking her what had happened, but she just stayed on the floor, completely freaked out. I knew what had happened. I don't know what came over me, but I completely lost it. I started yelling at my invisible house guest. I don't remember everything I said, but it boiled down to, "This is my house, and you're not welcome here." My friends were on the floor, looking up at me, yelling at nothing. And what's really strange is that they didn't look at me like I was crazy. They were scared. Later, they told me that they had seen some sort of big shadow behind me while I was yelling, and then it just turned around and left. I lived in that house for years after that, and nothing else ever happened.
Story 10. The Thing That Watched Me.
Just for a better understanding of my surroundings, I'm from Kentucky. There's a lot of wooded area, and people here love their guns, including me. I used to not believe that there were unknown creatures in the woods. I thought maybe Bigfoot could be real, but I severely doubted it. After what happened to me, I know there is something unknown out there. I had just bought my first AR-15 style rifle and bought a 60-round drum magazine for it at Gander Mountain while they were going out of business. Because why not? Reading up on the drum, I learned they were amazing and rarely had any issues at all. This detail will be important later. A few days after I got it, I finally decided to take it out for a test drive and sight in my gun a little better. Here's where everything went wrong. As I said before, Kentucky is super wooded. 3/4 of the land I lived on was just thick woods. There was a main path for driving our gator, and a few small paths our cows had made in the woods. I decided to walk along our creek, which had a small path half cleared by our cows. At the end of the path is a big field where our cows graze, and I use that field to sight in guns when the cows aren't there. As soon as I crossed the fence to go into the field, I instantly felt like I was being watched closely. I brushed it off because I'd walked back there 1,000 times before and never been bothered by anything. So I keep walking, ignoring the feeling of being watched, but at the same time, I'm aware of it. The walk to the field along the creek is very short, maybe 2 minutes at a slow pace. The further I walked, the more intense the feeling got, like I was getting closer to whatever was watching me. About halfway there, the feeling became so intense that I couldn't ignore it anymore. The drum magazine I had with me was unloaded, so I stopped and started loading it. I only brought 20 rounds with me because I was just going to sight in my gun, and 20 rounds should have been plenty. As I was stopped, paying extremely close attention to what was going on around me, I started loading my magazine. The exact moment I started putting rounds in the drum, I smelled something dead, like it had been rotting in the sun for a while. I started looking around, and right behind me was what was left of a possum. It was torn to pieces, almost like it had been placed there for me to find. The only thing was, it looked like it had been dead maybe a day at most, while the smell seemed like it had been decomposing for much longer. This obviously didn't set well with me, so I hurried to finish loading the magazine. I guess I should have taken the dead possum as a last chance to turn around. I decided to keep going. I had never had any problems back there before, so I assumed my brain was just being paranoid. I was almost to the field when I saw it. I was at the end of the creek, and the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Just as I was near the end of the creek and the edge of the woods, I heard a splash in the water. Being on edge, I immediately turned toward the noise, gun ready. But no round in the chamber. Walking down the creek away from me was something I will never forget. It was at least 8 feet tall, probably taller. It was very skinny. Imagine a grown man who weighs 120 pounds. Now stretch him out to be 8 feet tall, but his body width stays the same. He had very long arms, and it walked on 2 legs. The skin stretched tightly across its body. It made no noise aside from the splash when it stepped in the creek while it walked. It also had a weird walk, almost like a waddle, but taking large steps. That could have been because it was on a muddy creek bank. It was also a light brown color, almost like the color of a deer. That's all I can remember about it right now. Now I know why I felt like I was being watched. I loaded the magazine, the bolt ready to send a round into the chamber. Remember how I said the magazine was extremely reliable? I pressed the bolt release on the gun to chamber a round. Just in case this monstrous thing decided to attack, I did not intend to strike first. The round got stuck somehow and didn't even budge out of the magazine. I had never used that magazine before, so it didn't fail from heavy use. A bolt closing from a gun has enough force to break your finger. So why didn't this magazine work? My only guess is that thing had something to do with it. The magazine never worked right again, and I had to return it to the manufacturer. Needless to say, I didn't tell them this happened. I just told them the magazine failed several times. Anyway, back to the creature. The gun jammed on the first round, which is usually the easiest. The creature took off without running or making any noise. I had just long enough exposure to it to get the details I provided. Now, for assumptions. This happened about late May of last year. I still have the emails from the manufacturer regarding the drum, so I'm using those as reference because after this I needed something reliable. As for what the creature was, me and a friend who knows more about this stuff than I do have decided it could have been a Wendigo. The reason we think it was a Wendigo is that everything I described matches them near perfectly. I had read that they are incredibly thin and tall, have a stench of death that follows them everywhere, are very fast, can be several colours, light brown included, and sometimes violently kill other animals to scare humans. The only thing we couldn't come up with was its behaviour. Why am I still alive? Wendigos are supposed to be incredibly aggressive. Aside from watching me, it did nothing. It didn't try to attack or confront me. It ran away from me like it was scared or trying to draw me where it wanted me. This being said, I have never had another encounter with it. I've gone to the same field, taking the same path, expecting to be watched. But I haven't gotten that feeling of being watched as strongly as that day. Something was out there, and you can't convince me otherwise. I've tried to trick myself into thinking I'm being watched out there, but it still had no comparison to that day.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.